Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge. For so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Bourton into the open air. How fresh, how calm. Stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning. Like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18 as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen, looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, musing among the vegetables, was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers. Was that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out on the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July. She forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and, when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was, a few sayings like this about cabbages. Welcome to the Virtual Jewel Box, podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm Scott Black, director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and that was the first page of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, written in 1925. As Mrs. Dalloway starts its second century, we're going to try a new thing on the Virtual Jewel Box, an occasional series of discussions about great books. We're starting with one of my very favorite books, Mrs. Dalloway, and I'm joined by my colleague from the English department, Jessica Straley, also a fan of Woolf and someone who's just taught a class on Virginia Woolf. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, Scott. Really happy to be here.
Glad you can join me to talk about Woolf's great novel. So, do you want to set the scene a little bit, talk about some of the key features of the novel that you like to start with when you start talking to students about it?
Sure, I can do that. So Mrs. Dalloway is Woolf's fourth novel, but for a lot of classes coming to Woolf or readers first starting with Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway is still a really good novel to start with. It's usually considered the one where we see her accomplishing her style, although her style changes from novel to novel, which is what makes her an amazing writer. But to give listeners a really quick background, Virginia Woolf and her husband, Leonard Woolf, were part of what we call Bloomsbury, right? A group of artists, authors, philosophers initially gathered by Woolf's brother, Toby Stevens, when he was a student at Cambridge, and then who continued to meet and talk about social issues, political issues, current events, art, the meaning of art, new ways of expression in both literature and the visual arts in the Bloomsbury district in London. Woolf was working as a reviewer of contemporary fiction. And as a reviewer of contemporary fiction, she was very frustrated by the baggy realism of the Victorian style. As a Victorianist, I love the baggy realism of the Victorian style, but her lampoons are quite on the nose and very good. As an author, she still felt constrained by that style. But in 1917, she and her husband started their own press, Hogarth Press. And it was there that they could really publish what they wanted, how they wanted, not only in the content of the books that they were publishing, but the material style of what the books looked like. So this is her second novel, writing for the Hogarth Press, and here she develops what we might want to talk about as stream of consciousness, where the novel is weaving in and out of different people's thoughts as they move through London. And she has this wonderful moment in a review that she does of an author named Arnold Bennett, who she really takes to task because he wrote a review that criticized her previous novel. But she says he has every detail of the clothes people are wearing and the wood that the banisters are made out of. And she says, but where is life? Life escapes somehow. And it's to capture that she's using this stream of consciousness style. And what that means really is she's in this first passage that Scott read, we're mostly in Clarissa's head, hearing her thoughts, but the novel weaves in and out of multiple characters, some that Clarissa knows, some that she doesn't know, many as they pass each other on the streets of London, where the novel takes place. And we're getting their thoughts to touch at something more real than realism. And I think if we want to look at this page, what I love and what I always start with when I teach and I get stuck on again and again when I read is this first sentence, which almost says everything we need to know. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Completely mundane sentence. You can read that and pass over it. Okay, so who's this lady? And she's going to buy flowers. And yet, in this 3-part repetition of the character, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. There's 3 different versions of character being represented here. The Mrs. Dalloway, her official title, her social standing, the one who speaks, the one who exists at the level of discourse, said she would buy the flowers. The second she, the doing, the active, the she who is sort of in declaring she's going to buy the flowers herself, moving independently, almost immediately away from Mrs. Dalloway, her social title. She's not going to have the servants do it. She's going to buy the flowers. She's going to cross London. She's going to have this experience. But the one that the sentence lands on, herself, that's the one that Woolf is trying to get at, that subjective selfhood. And that is the project of the novel. And that self is something adjacent to, attached to, but not completely contained by the Mrs. Dalloway and the she that comes earlier in the sentence.
And it's really interesting because it's a third-person sentence that is an omniscient narrator telling you what Mrs. Dalloway said to Lucy, who we hear from in the next moment. But there's a subtle shift in that third person. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. She's actually reporting what Mrs. Dalloway thought and said in what we call free indirect discourse, which is the representation of someone's thinking in their own terms in a third-person narration. And then the rest of the passage that I'd read before is actually what Mrs. Dalloway's thinking. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. This is why Mrs. Dalloway said to Lucy, I'm going to buy the flowers myself. And then the next paragraph, what a lark, what a plunge, is fully within Clarissa's head. It's her memories of the time when she was 18 at Bourton. And she's comparing the morning she's stepping out into in London in 1920s. So this is a post-war novel set after World War I in a recovering London or a partially recovering London. There's a Septimus Smith is one of the main characters. He is a war veteran with what was then called shell shock, what we would call PTSD. Her friend Peter, we've met, is another of the main characters. She has a husband, Richard. She has a daughter. Her daughter has a tutor. There's all kinds of people who show up in the novel. The main characters, however, are Clarissa, Peter, and Septimus, and the novel spends the most time in each of their heads, although it jumps out into other heads. To back up a second, what a lark, what a plunge. I always imagine Clarissa, this is set in London, I imagine her standing on one of those London stoops about to walk down the stairs. And she's thinking about stepping down the stairs and what a beautiful morning it is. This beautiful morning reminds her of this morning at her family's house in the country at Bourton when she's 18 years old, as we find out for a girl of 18 as she then was. And she's imagining stepping down the stoop in London in the same way that she stepped out of the French windows at Bourton on this really gorgeous spring day.
And so part of the self, that herself, is about memory. And this novel that takes place on this singular day in June in 1922, for Clarissa also contains this previous day, 34, 35 years earlier, whereas, as you're saying, Scott, she's at the summer house, she's with Peter, this friend of hers from her youth. She remembers him. He comes to visit during this day in the present as well. He's in London. And both go back and forth remembering their previous relationship. They almost married. He wanted to marry her. She married someone else. And they're remembering a summer when she makes the decision to marry someone else, when their relationship comes to an end. And that lives within this moment and their relationship in the present day.
And they have remained very close friends. There's a sense that each of them feels almost closer to each other than they do to anyone else, including their current husband, Richard, for Clarissa, including Peter's been married once. He's now about to marry again. He's been in India as a colonial administrator. But they still feel incredibly close. And there's a scene, as you said, Peter's just come back from India, as he told Clarissa he would. She doesn't remember exactly when, but then he shows up at her house. And there's a really powerful scene where they're together and sort of all this stuff is coming back to them. And the book itself is, as you said, it's Clarissa's thoughts, her stream of consciousness, but it dives into memory as our consciousness does. Suddenly things remind her of Peter. And their day where they each spend time walking around London and thinking is full of that summer. They're both remembering this summer, kind of in concert but separately. This really momentous moment where Clarissa chose to marry Richard instead of Peter.
Yeah, and I know you like this part. It's part of what you like about this first passage, this movement from her present material reality to what's happening in her memory happens at the little squeak of the hinges.
Right.
So what's happening in the house is she's planning a party that night. Lucy, who we've mentioned several times, is one of the servants working in the Dalloway household. Other people are there to take the doors off the hinges, the interior doors in the house, to allow more flow of the partygoers. And when she hears that little squeak of the hinges, she hears another squeak of the hinges, which is what you were saying, throwing open the French window of this summer home that's on the coast. And that it is that sound that moves her into a past. And that is what Woolf is capturing, not only this movement, but what moves us. And those lovely little sounds or little things that happen are also what connect the characters as we move through London. So she's crossing the street and a car backfires. She hears the car backfire. Everyone else hears the car backfire. And Woolf moves us from Clarissa hearing it to another character hearing it. And those are the hinges. I mean, they're literally hinges, right? Yeah, the hinges from one character to another, from one state of being to another, from one sense of reality to another.
Exactly. And the first time we hear Septimus Smith, who is just one of a group of passers-by on the sidewalk, the first time we meet him and his wife Rezia is when they are hearing that car backfiring, which sounds like a gun to some people. And that's actually really significant. It's significant because this is a moment of post-war London, a moment of peace after World War I has been finished. And so it's sort of significant that what sounds like a gun is actually just a mundane car backfiring. But for Septimus, or for some people, that memory of the war is still very, very much with them. And this is a thematic point of the novel, the sort of unequal recovery from the war. Before we get away from the first passage, I just have to say one last thing about it. There's a lot we could say about it. But when Clarissa says, "What a lark, what a plunge," this is a moment where she's, I think, plunging, in a sense, physically down the stoop. She's walking down the stoop. But Woolf also builds in a plunge into memory. So as she's walking down the stoop on her front of her house in London, she's also plunging into the past. And this is something that the novel keeps saying. She comes back, is what Peter thinks of Clarissa. At the strangest times, I'll suddenly think of her. And Clarissa, as you said, there's all kinds of echoes between the character, keeps saying this about Peter. He comes back. So let's go ahead and read just a little bit more. This is from the second page of the novel. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels, even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense, but that might be her heart, affected, they said, by influenza, before Big Ben strikes. There, out it boomed, first a warning musical, then the hour irrevocable, the leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street, for heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every morning afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries sitting on their doorsteps, drink their downfall, do the same, can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by acts of parliament for that very reason. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, and the triumph in the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead was what she loved. Life, London, this moment of June. It's absolutely wonderful prose. One of the things I love most about Woolf is what she talks about as waves. She talks a lot about waves. She's got a novel entitled Waves. But the rhythm of the prose itself is so compelling. If you hear it read, if you read it to yourself, you really are caught up in the rhythm. She is an absolute master of the semicolon, that lost form of punctuation that's somewhere between a comma and a period that sort of gives you just the pause you need to capture the rhythm of the sentence, but then drives you forward so you never come to a complete stop. Anyhow, I could talk about her prose for a long time. What's actually going on in this passage? This, for me, is one of the sort of thematically central passages that sets up the whole novel, the problem of making it up as she goes along, which is actually her account of perception. For her, perception is an active activity, something that, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one. We're not passively receiving things, we're actually participating in the construction of our experience of the world through the very act of seeing it. That's fascinating. And also the idea of love. This is something that everyone feels, this sense of the beauty of the world, whether it's not the beauty of the world, but some kind of commitment or passion for it. Everyone feels it. And then she has what for me is almost like a Walt Whitman-like list of all the things she's seeing in London right now, concluding with what she loved, life, London, this moment of June.
I think it's worth noting at this point that this novel occurs over the course of a single day. And yet that day contains her entire life and all of the characters' entire lives because of the way that memory or selfhood or consciousness works. And it is a love story. And the novel is a love story too. Life, London, this moment in June. What you're saying, Scott, about how perception works, this tells us a lot about Clarissa. We learn that she has a heart problem. We learn that she has rather problematic attitudes about the unhoused. We learn that she is also kind of taken in by the technologies of traffic and of transportation. You mentioned back when cars have backfires. And yet at the same time, that's a really new thing here in 1925. We're at the beginning of automobile transportation. And so that sets us in this moment in June, both in Clarissa's consciousness, the sense that she's in her middle age now, her heart affected by influenza. She's moving back and forth between her teens and now. And Big Ben makes an important figure here, too. We have the clock that is striking, that is giving a sense of official time, that is subjectively understood. There, out it boomed. First a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. I've always been taken by this image of this thinking about time or the boom or the sound as a physical manifestation as it dissolves. The hour is there, it's irrevocable, time has passed, that this comes right after a parenthetical that draws attention to her own mortality, the sickness in her heart, as if those leaden circles are the parentheses as they dissolve into the narrative, as the past and the present, as the past sort of comes into the present and the present into the past. So I've always loved that image in particular, that time exists, it's leaden, it's heavy, and yet it also evaporates at a moment's notice and allows us to move back and forth in periods of time.
And the prose is capturing the sound waves themselves. It's fantastic. I will say at the first page where she talks about something awful about to happen, that's a much older sense of awful. It's more literally full of awe. And that awe... Awesome, exactly, is what we would probably say. And that sense of awe is also what Big Ben seems to be suggesting here. And as you said, this is a novel that's set in one day. The novel tells time throughout. Big Ben keeps striking every 15 minutes. It's also worth saying the events of the novel, the plot of the novel, such as it is Clarissa's throwing a party. So the flowers that she said she would buy herself are actually the flowers for the party that she will give that night. And the novel ends in an absolutely gorgeous scene of this party where all of her acquaintances and old friends too. Peter comes to the party. Sally Seton, who we have to talk about as well, is at the party, as well as the Prime Minister. Richard is a member of Parliament. He's a politician, and so a lot of the political class come to the party. William Bradshaw is a very important doctor who is treated disastrously. Septimus Smith, he comes to the party. The party's full of everyone we've been meeting throughout the day who gather at Clarissa's house. And this is one of the things that Clarissa feels good about, is that she can put together all these people in a good party. It's something that Peter, when he was younger, used to tease her or mock her about. He calls her the perfect hostess in disdain because she's so social. And she's embarrassed about this, but it turns out she's actually kind of a great hostess and really hosts a wonderful party. I say this now because the idea of making it up, building it up round one, that's a first suggestion of one of Clarissa's real gifts, which is to bring people together. In bringing people together as a hostess, in bringing all, and she has moments where she reflects on what it means to give a party in response to the sort of very gendered disdain that Peter and her husband have for her being a good hostess. In response to that, she thinks about why it's important to bring people together. And there's a sense that that idea of building it up and making it up, building it up around one, is what consciousness is doing. It's also what she does with the party socially. And it's also, of course, what the novel is doing, which is bringing all these people together in one narrative that can slide in and out of them and associate them and coordinate them with one another in the same way that the party does socially.
We open with her thinking about taking the doors off the hinges for the practical realities of a party so that people can move from one room to another and form new constellations and groupings. But the party is taking the doors off the hinges. It's allowing that kind of connection between minds, between consciousnesses that's so essential. And so the party is a kind of bourgeois luxury, but it is also about real human connection with limits. And Scott and I have talked about this issues later in the novel and thinking, how close can you be? What is being too close to someone? That plays into why she doesn't marry Peter and marries Richard instead.
I do want to talk about Sally. Sally Seton is the other major figure in the Borton memory. That summer in Borton, Sally sort of barges in. She is
exuberant.
She is very much an early 20th century new woman. She shocks Clarissa's father. She smokes. She cuts off the stems of flowers and puts the flower heads in bowls of water, which was shocking to the bourgeois family that Clarissa had. And Clarissa and Peter and Sally are all really, really close. They're 18 years old. This is a moment of one of those teenage groups, an intensely bonding group. And Clarissa is in love with Sally, erotically in love with Sally. There's a moment where she stands at the top of the stairs holding a watering can, I think, and thinks, Sally is in this house. It's one of the truly beautiful moments of teenage desire, I know. And they kiss. They have a really momentous kiss. But this is 1922 in a part of British society where lesbianism is not accepted. And nothing comes of this. She actually ends up getting married, and she never thinks about marrying Sally. That would not be possible.
Well, that's part of the beauty of the relationship with Sally, and she explicitly says that. It is because it is a love completely removed from the expectations of marriage that gives it a kind of freedom attached to that moment, because it doesn't have a future in the same way, because it is so of the moment, and that summer is part of what makes it so beautiful, whereas the prospect of marriage would almost screw it up.
And when she does decide to marry Richard, for Peter, that seems like a real cop-out because they were so close. And now we'll get into some of the interesting things. So the novel is very concerned with connecting people, with associating people, with discussing the various ways that people are webbed together. Sort of narratively, it does this by jumping from person to person, but it also, Woolf also does this by showing you how people think about each other and think about their connections. However, it's also very aware of the limits of that. There are other kinds of connections, other kinds of consciousness in the novel, like Septimus Smith's, who is also really concerned with connection, but for him, it's a kind of shell shock sense that the world is almost caving in an unmanageable way. He's deeply affected by PTSD, and some of the things that Clarissa values are things that scare Septimus or are causing him great distress. So Septimus is sort of a story of his version, his strand in the novel is the sort of dark side of many of the things that Clarissa values.
If the beauty and the joy and the love story part of Clarissa's consciousness is this ability to contain the past in this moment, in this present moment, that is horror for Septimus, for whom this present moment in June contains the violence and the death and the atrocities of war. That is part of his shell shock, if we're going by their term, PTSD, if we go by ours. This paragraph that you ended with, that we read, ends with the strange high singing of some airplane overhead. You already mentioned the car backfire that Septimus hears as a gun. The airplane overhead has a lot of horrible connotations for Londoners who have gone through the First World War, where London was bombed from planes. So those moments of connection, as I said before, as we move between minds and thoughts in London. All of those noises, those city noises, are horrifying for Septimus. And his inability to live in the present moment, to separate himself from his past, is, as you said, the kind of dark side of what's happening for Clarissa. What brings Clarissa joy brings him terror.
Another way that Woolf is interested in the sort of limits of connection, one of the things that Peter thinks about Clarissa is that he says, or he thinks to himself as he's reflecting in one of his streams of consciousness narration moments, he thinks we went in and out of each other's minds effortlessly. And that's exactly what the novel does in its style. It goes in and out of people's minds. Yet Clarissa chose Richard rather than Peter to marry. And she, although Peter can't understand this, is very happy with that decision, precisely because she and Richard have space in their marriage. They communicate without talking. They have a certain kind of distance from each other, which at one point Clarissa thinks is necessary for a married life, to live with someone. You need to have some kind of boundaries and space. And I think the novel also, although it's one of the most empathetic novels concerned with how we feel and know each other, it's also recognized another important aspect of living with people, and that's having space between them. There are a couple moments where Clarissa looks at a woman across the way in another house right next to her and has some really significant thematic reflections on the necessity of privacy of the soul, she says, and doesn't develop that one relationship between Clarissa and her next-door neighbor at all. There's a kind of discretion at those moments that I think echoes the way that Clarissa herself thinks about marriage. So the novel is full of sort of both the connections but also the limits. It's as interested in the failures of connection and the limits of connection and the necessary limits of connection as it is in thinking about how we all are together in this world.
There's a moment where Richard brings Clarissa flowers to sort of reverse this. She said she would buy the flowers herself. He brings her flowers. He has brunch with other people, a luncheon with other people, and decides, I'm going to bring her flowers and I'm going to tell her that I love her. And when he gets home with the flowers, he can't say it. And I know for my students reading this, this is a moment of failure at first, right? It seems like why can't he say it? Why can't he tell his wife that he loves her? Like, he's such a stiff, right? Or something is lacking. But it is the relationship that Clarissa has, we get a sense, very consciously chosen. As you're saying, Scott, about Peter, she's like, oh, it would be like this all day. He knows what I'm thinking. I know what he's thinking. We know each other's failures. We know each other's successes. We're completely overlapped. But she does want distance to maintain that independence of selfhood, the same independence that says, I'm going to buy the flowers myself, the privacy of the soul. And it is part of this dive into memories. These are hers. They're not Richard's. They're not for Richard. They're for herself. And that becomes really essential to personhood, to selfhood, and to the kinds of relationships that, at least in this novel, are deemed as good. And her relationship with Richard is good. They have exactly the amount of intimacy that Clarissa wants with another person.
And it is difficult for our students. I get this as well. And for them, it seems really cold and British or really snooty and
Yeah, I
upper
didn't
class.
say British. I said stiff.
But yeah, listen, having reached a certain age, having now gotten older than Clarissa, I actually appreciate this with the people I'm close with, that we actually can share space without necessarily always sharing everything. I think that kind of silence at the heart of relationships is actually a function of a good association, a good connection. And it's interesting. I think silence is as important as the really voluble language. And, Woolf's prose is absolutely gorgeous. I really, people should read, and they should read this out loud or get a really good audiobook. There's excellent audiobooks of this, just for the beauty of her language. Don't even worry about what it's saying. It's just utterly gorgeous. But one of the reasons it's so gorgeous is, as I was saying before, because it's intensely rhythmic. And one of the important features of rhythm is that it works with both sound and silence. And I think the silence, the sort of, which is necessary to rhythm, is also thematically necessary to sort of the rhythms of thinking or the rhythms of relation, which the book is so concerned with.
And now we're back to the glory of the semicolon.
Now we're back to the glory.
Which is the only reason I say read it. Don't do the audiobook. Read it, because you have to see the punctuation, which sounds very English teacher of me. But the semicolon here is so beautiful. And it is about that connection that is still a demarcation, right? It still allows those clauses a discrete identity to themselves, and yet connects them to the other clauses in a way a period would be a dead stop. So the grammar itself is thematically relevant to this idea of connection and privacy, connection that maintains some sense of privacy.
And this is why Woolf is such a brilliant writer, because the sound, the very punctuation, and the sense all come together. She's thinking about writing a novel and also just writing prose in every dimension at once, and every aspect becomes an echo of some other aspect, which is actually how the novel thinks about time. Every moment of your life is contained at any given time, if you can sort of recognize it, or if maybe not you recognize it, if it bubbles up. There's the chance of punctuation becoming meaning, becoming sound, all at the same time.
And the semicolon hasn't disappeared. My students did inform me that the semicolon has become significant in messages for suicide prevention, that there is the sense of there's something on the other side. The sentence continues. There can be a conclusion to one stage, but that's not an end. And this does play into this love of life that she's expressing here, despite senses of her own mortality, despite the horrors of war, despite much of the trauma and tragedy that goes on through this book. The semicolon is still a symbol of hope, at least in today's kind of texting culture, according to my students, which I think is beautiful as well.
That's lovely. And I'm so glad we can end with a semicolon, because a semicolon is exactly what we want to suggest here. There's much, much more to both Mrs. Dalloway and Woolf's writing than we've had time to talk about today. So we'll just put a semicolon on this. Perfect. And say there's more to discover. There's more to love. Thanks so much for talking with me,
Scott.
Jessica.
It was fun.
This is great. Please go read Mrs. Dalloway. It's an absolutely wonderful novel. You've been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box, podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. Our music is Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag. Thanks for joining us.